knew that, and I think I put K in the place where you say, what do you want on
Uh-huh.
your thing. But I decided not to make an issue of it this time. I'm mellowing in my old age.
Well, I think they used to just put the formal name, so,
Oh, yeah.
and then people
It took me
started.
years because I would growl at them. You know, my name, I go by K.
Yeah.
Not even my mother, when she was mad at me, ever called me Catherine.
Well, that's a good lead into my introduction. I have the privilege of interviewing Kay Boniface, and you are one of the originators of the Ohio Women in Psychology.
Yes.
And so I think just that whole experience of being a woman in psychology during that time would be very informative and interesting.
Well, the background from my point of view was that from 75 to early in 1980, I directed a drug treatment program, a freestanding, it had been freestanding, then became part of the mental health center for various reasons. And it was a, drug-free, et cetera, treatment program. And I got very actively involved at the state level for a variety of reasons that I don't need to go into here. And I went through training of trainers, the NIDA training of trainers all the way, training system all the way up to training of trainers. And somewhere in there, a couple of things happened. There was the Year of the Woman, which I think was even earlier than 75. And because of my background in AOD, which wasn't known as AOD or anything much at the time, I started in that field in 1962, I think. I kind of backed into it through a research project at Family Service in Cincinnati. And I didn't always do it full time, but I was never away from it. And I got no graduate training. I will tell you the graduate training, but not on camera. It was pretty awful. So Bobby Stern, who was a council member in Cincinnati in those days, asked me to represent Cincinnati at the Year of the Woman on the drug panel. And we came up to Columbus and had a big meeting and everything. And then later on, I started running this drug treatment program right after I got my doctorate. It was my first job. And there was something else that I'm trying to remember her name. She was at the federal level. Nellis, Muriel Nellis, something. I don't really remember her name exactly, but was doing something that involved surveying with regard to women's needs in drug treatment. And from that, we founded a group somewhat similar to Women in Psychology, but more focused on the client. In drug abuse. And then I got appointed to some commission that I think it was Governor Celeste in those days had. One thing led to another. Well, in 1980, I took a job in the city of Cincinnati working in one of the health clinics in Lower Price Hill Health Center. And my role there was general psychology, including substance abuse, but I certainly wasn't focused on it, and they were not about to support me going to Columbus for drug abuse stuff.
Interesting.
But I did need by then to keep up licensure. I was licensed in April of 73. Okay, my license number is 669. It would have been sooner, I would have been lower, except the city of Cincinnati, the University of Cincinnati, sat on my transcript for several weeks. I don't know what that was about, but anyway. So I could tell them that they, if they wanted me as a psychologist, which they did, I needed to go to professional meetings and get my continuing education, even though I'm not sure it was required. But at that point, there was a long time between when we got licensure and when continuing ed
that's interesting.
became a requirement. And I was talking with some colleagues last night, trying to figure out when it became effective, and it may have been around 1980 because somebody in the group had said that she joined in 1980 and it was already mandatory. But before then, somebody at Miami University was doing like an informal thing that you could sign up for and whatnot, and I did because I thought it might be useful. There was considerable debate that nobody had demonstrated the efficacy of continuing. Anyway, so that I know it was in 1980 that I became active with OPA. I think I may have joined because I don't think I'd been a member previously. I knew about it, of course. And at the first meeting I went to, which was probably the fall conference in 1980.
Okay.
It might have been that we had two conferences back then. There was a spring conference.
I think there was a point, yeah.
Oh, there was. One of them was always in Columbus, and the other was circulated around the state. And I remember going to Cleveland, to Akron, and once it was in Dayton. I think it was in Cincinnati, and and that might have been the spring one that moved. And then the fall one was in Columbus, or maybe it was the other way around. I don't remember, but I remember that very clearly, because sometimes I didn't go to the really other end of the state ones. In any case, Dr. Joanne King, with whom I'd had some contact through another program that I was involved in, which was the Ohio State, what was it, the Ohio State? It was through the Hospital Association, Drug and Alcohol Education, Drug Abuse and Alcohol Abuse Education training program, where we were sent out in groups, teams of 5, to educate people in emergency rooms about drug abuse treatment, because at the time emergency room people were refusing to treat on the grounds they didn't know anything about drug abuse, and we went out and persuaded them that you treat an emergency like any other emergency. You do the appropriate interventions, and yes, you do know enough to take care of these people, because we were losing people. And so I had met Joanne through that. So she raised her, stood up at the banquet and asked if there were any women who would be interested in, please raise your hand. Well, there I was. And that's how it didn't coalesce to be OWP immediately. I think I'm not sure what we called it. I think we named it later on. And we started out, doing some organizing, and there were a bunch of other women involved. Some of us are still involved with it.
That's wonderful.
We did some regional stuff initially. We started regional groups. And we did some other things kind of at the state level, but the focus at that time became importantly to have OPA trainings include material that was focused specifically on women's issues, women's needs of women psychologists, and so on, because there had been very little of that at that time. Up to then, and we would, we had a strong part in the education committee, and were able to make recommendations about who to bring in, and very often we would bring somebody in for a workshop, but we would also get them to do a presentation to OWP. And in fact, part of the way that the conference is now organized has to do with us, because we started coming in a day before the conference started. If I remember correctly, it used to be Thursday, Friday, and I think part of Saturday. And we started to come in the night before. Maybe it wasn't. Don't quote me on this. But we started to, because we wanted to have our own meeting. But
that's nice.
And we had panels. We had speakers, as I mentioned, who were brought in to do a full presentation, not necessarily on a woman's related issue, but then we'd have a speaker, they'd have them speak or do a panel discussion or something. And we started the Lifetime Achievement Award program.
That's wonderful.
As a way of honoring and according recognition to some of the outstanding. Ohio has, to my knowledge, pretty much always had outstanding women psychologists. In fact, before we started this taping, we were trying to, a couple of people, some of us who've been around for a while, were trying to remember a few years ago, I think it's a few, maybe many years ago now, somebody located an extremely elderly woman psychologist that none of us at that point had ever heard of, and I'm unfortunately unable to recollect her name at the moment. But she was close to 100.
Oh my.
And she was living, I think, pretty much isolated on her own. And you know, we had her come to the convention and
Oh,
we gave
that's
her an
wonderful.
honor. It was really wonderful. But, you know, even a lot of us who've been around weren't always, and weren't always necessarily aware. She was not from Cincinnati area.
Mm-hmm.
But there are women like Virginia Graham, who was an early clinician. Back in the day when her office mate, Murray Teeger, was practicing in an office with a psychiatrist. This was way before licensure. I came to Cincinnati in '61, and I think Murray was already in practice at that time. He was an adjunct at the university, and I took 2 really excellent classes from him,
Mm-hmm.
one of which was an advanced undergraduate class in abnormal psychology. It was a requirement for the
Mm-hmm.
undergraduate degree, and later on I took an outstanding case conference that I've used as a model from time to time in terms of the format. But he and Dr. Graham were in practice in the same office with a psychiatrist, and at that time I remember him telling us at one time that you were very careful about how you answered the phone because there was a good risk of being charged with practicing medicine without a license.
Oh,
and this was
my.
before psychology had licensure.
Yes.
But he and people like Jenny Brown were very brave and went into practice anyway with the support of some psychiatric colleagues. I was naive enough, and I don't know how they handled billing and that sort of arrangement, but there may not have been any insurance payments involved in those days anyway.
Probably
I
not.
don't know. But thinking back, I mean, this goes back to certainly the early 60s, probably the late 50s. And I studied with Howard Lyman, who was certainly I think he was one of the founding members of OPA, which would have been after the Second World War, I think. I'm not sure how long OPA actually goes back.
61 years.
61 years, so that would be, help me with the math here.
Since 2010.
40
So,
something.
yeah.
49 maybe?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So after what happened, my understanding of the history of psychology in general is that World War II brought psychology pretty much into focus,
Yes.
not into being because we've been around for a long time, but because of the participation in the war effort. And when they came back, they started organizing state associated.
Us.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, they needed us, and then once that had happened, we became more clearly a profession, particularly the clinical side of it, as opposed to the academic side. I think that's what happened, it seems to me. And so by 49, they were probably, I would guess there had been some preliminary efforts to organize or whatever, but I know Dr. Lyman was very actively involved. He was an early president of OPA, if I'm not mistaken. And he was a very interesting man. He taught statistics, but what he did was write a book called Test Scores and What They Mean, which was an attempt that was not terribly well received by the academics to help to either make clear directly to parents of children or people who were being tested what it was all about and what it meant when you were handed this information in language that everyday people could understand.
Mm-hmm.
There was at that time still, I think, a real wish to preserve the secrecy, to protect the
profession.
profession in ways that today we don't really think about that much. So he was a very, very early advocate of let's talk to people, let's give them something that they can understand. And I remember it created quite a bit of consternation at the time. And I won't go into the other things I heard about it, but it's an excellent book. I used it in my practice. I don't know if it's still in print or not, and it's probably out of date with regard to some of the tests that are used these days in statistics and so on. But I studied with him when I first came to UC.
And it sounds like his concept of making it user-friendly really fits with how you
It fits very much with how I
practicing.
think about it, but I don't think I would have thought about it that way if I hadn't had people like Dr. Lyman in my life, and Dr. Allen Smith, who became the head of department the chair at Cincinnati in '61, the same year I came.
Mm-hmm.
And I came from a tradition where, your professional vocabulary was something you showed off, and he was very much into using plain language. And I remember him discussing this with me, would be a polite way of putting it. I guess it must have been my first year in graduate school, I'm not sure.
Uh-huh.
And, he said, but you need to take into consideration the person with whom you're trying to communicate. Nobody had ever put that to me before.
And it's a revolutionary
idea. It was a very revolutionary
Yes.
idea to me, if that tells you anything. But there was, and there were people who did not believe that. There was a kind of a diversity of opinion, if you will. And those were people who had gotten into the field, I would guess, in the 50s, late 50s, probably. Oh, let's see. Alan Smith brought in the following year Leonard Lansky and William Seaman.
Okay.
They both came in, I think, that second year. He rebuilt the department. The department had apparently been a really outstanding one.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I wound up in Cincinnati. A friend of the family knew about it, thought it was still at the level it had been. In the interim, the then professor, who was the head of the department, had died.
Oh.
And the department had kind of subsequently gone through a kind of a low period. And it just happened that the year that I came, Alan Smith came in and then did a real major building up of the department in the next couple of years to get APA accreditation and so on. And the two of the first people that he brought in were Leonard Lansky and Will Seaman.
Did you see any shift while you were in the program in openness and support for women to be in the profession? Okay.
No. We didn't even know, we were naive enough that we didn't even know that, well, we knew that we were being given a rough time, but we didn't connect it.
Uh-huh.
And not to say that guys weren't being given a rough time,
Right.
too. There was a whole macho kind of approach to graduate training, which said we were made to suffer, and if we were made to suffer, you're going to suffer at least the same, maybe more so. This
Yes.
was made very plain.
Yes.
And I don't care to go into some of the details, but it was directed, a lot of it was also directed against the guys, but in retrospect it was also focused very much against women, to the point where after I'd gotten out of that program, I finally dropped out. I got my master's and I licensed.
Okay.
And then when I went back in education. My doctorate's in education. All my credentials are in clinical psychology. I took PhD comps, I took clinical qualifying exams. But I did not go back into the psych department. I got a call from somebody representing one of the federal agencies that was investigating the department at that time.
Oh my.
For women's issues. It was in the 70s and women's issues were on the table and whatnot. And I told them that I hadn't, I gave them some names of people who were then currently graduate students. I said, I can't say what it's like now.
Mm-hmm.
I can tell you what it was like back then. But we were too naive to even recognize it for what it was. So I was not current enough in what was going on at that time. And I don't know what happened to the investigation. I don't even really remember what it was about, but it was clearly focused on unequal treatment of women.
Interesting. And did OWP, it sounds like the organization of OWP was addressing some of those issues, but did they actually provide mentorship for young women or intervene?
We did. We had a kind of mentoring program at one point where we were trying to, I wasn't directly involved with that. My career has been kind of atypical because I was in the public sector for many years in contexts that were not mental health.
Okay.
I ran the drug treatment program. I got my doctorate finally and ran the drug treatment program, and was very active in the whole drug abuse system at the state, and to some extent at the federal level.
Okay.
In terms of that survey, we developed a survey about women's issues, et cetera, plugged into Muriel Nellis, I think her name was. Anyway, but it was definitely outside of the psychology
Oh, okay. That's
community.
interesting. Uh-huh.
And then I took a job with the city of Cincinnati at the Price Hill Health Center, which is a birth-to-death health center, not mental health. I was asked to come in and direct an outpatient adolescent treatment program, of which I was the mental health component. But we had education, we had nutrition, we had physics, we ran a clinic, a health clinic, for people between the ages of 11 or 12 and 18.
Wonderful.
It was.
So it really was integrated care.
It was integrated care. It was cutting edge integrated care before the feds figured it out, which they didn't do until about 95, at which point we've been doing it, or 93, excuse me, because that was when the city decided they didn't need that kind of. But it was, Addie Kochanowski, who was an administrator with the city in those days, brilliant woman, recently died a couple of years ago, and not a psychologist, wrote a grant for adolescent health. What they had done was looked at the holes in the age range that were being seen at the clinic, and they realized that the adolescent cohort just dropped out. I mean, people were being brought there as infants and being treated all through, like, maybe elementary school, and then coming back later in life, all the way up through, adulthood and geriatric. But there was this big gap in adolescent health services. And Addie was very interested in that. She was a grant writer for the city, and she wrote this grant, and they funded, for a period of some years, 5 or 6 different adolescent health centers that were in the health centers in the community. Cincinnati has a very different system of providing health care, and there are actual municipal clinics in a bunch of neighborhoods. And we had, at one point, I think we had 4 different adolescent programs, and she had knew me slightly, was slightly acquainted, and it doesn't matter how my resume happened to cross her desk, but I was approached to take on the directorship of that program, which I did. But I was also a clinician for it. And since I had background in AOD,
perfect.
Was quite pertinent. And so I did that. But that meant I was really not in touch with any other psychologists except kind of peripherally for quite a few years. And as I said, in 1980, I started getting involved in OPA because the continuing ed, and I really did want to have contact with psychologists. Yes. But it was limited by the fact that they weren't terribly interested in my going to local meetings or, giving me any time off. If I absolutely had to do it for license maintenance, and they were, okay with doing that. So. They kind of had to be since I was classified as a psychologist.
Right.
But because of that, my perspective on some of this is a little bit different probably from a lot of other people's. And I had no connection at all in those days with the academic part of it. When I did become a part of academia, I was invited to join the graduate faculty for addiction studies. That was under the criminal justice, college criminal justice at UC, and I did that for about 5 years. Unfortunately, they then I resigned for various reasons, and sometime after that, the program was eliminated. But so a lot of my academic and other kinds of experience have been outside of the mainstream of psychology, shall we say.
It almost sounds like it was community psychology before
it was health psychology
and
and community psychology before there was a name for it.
Yes.
And while I saw predominantly teenagers for a lot of the time I was at Price Hill Health Center, after the first 10 years, my role shifted somewhat, and I was kind of a general psychologist in terms of age range, seeing people from 11 or 12 on up. So I had some geriatric practice and adult practice. It was a slight internal reorganization that took place at that time. But yeah, later, I found out I was doing health psychology. Okay, that sounded good. That was what I was interested in, but there wasn't even a name for it.
Right.
And our idea with the adolescent program was to provide services that were specialized to the needs of the adolescent population. We had a lot of concern because of the high rate of teenage pregnancies.
Yes.
And I remember one of the first young women that I saw when I started was 12. And I did the usual, sort of introduction, trying to establish rapport and so on. And I said, well, what do you think you might want to do when you become an adult? Or she looked at me, she said, I want to have a baby. And I said, well, okay, but and then she said, no, she picked out a guy to be the father. She didn't care about him particularly, but she thought he'd be, I guess, cute.
That's 12-year-old criteria.
Well, yeah, but she was going to do this coming weekend. And so we had a discussion right then and there about maybe you could wait a little while. And I said, it wasn't for love of the guy or because she liked sex particularly, or she wanted a baby. And I started suggesting things like maybe a dog or a cat or babysitting or whatever. And one of the achievements of our program, and it involved some of our nursing staff and some of our other people, we got together and we could do some conjoint planning. She actually did not get pregnant until she was 16, which to some people may sound like it was a failure, but in our case, I had documentation that
12 was going to be it.
12 was going to be it.
Wow.
So we focused a lot on our young women. I mean, we focused on our young men as well, but we had some very urgent concerns.
Yes, yes.
About the women in our population, and I had some very, very excellent help from we had a nurse practitioner who, and I hired, was able to have a lot of choice in that, pick people who were really committed to meeting the needs of our teenagers. And who were able to think in those terms, and we had a separate clinic session for them.
Wonderful.
When the rest, apart from the hours for the rest of the clinic, and then we could see them during the week. I had enough, some of the staff was part-time in the teen program and part-time in the, we were able to organize the division of time so that they could come in during the week and talk to the nurse practitioner, or,
very nice.
And we had people in the schools. It was a really excellent, very well-designed program. It was a wonderful thing to be part of. And we didn't really think we were cutting edge. We thought we were doing the right thing.
Right, right. How nice to be both.
How nice to be both. And then I started finding out how different we were from most other places, but we got the kids into the clinic.
That's
and
fantastic.
we were able to do a lot of prevention things, and all kinds of things that were helpful to that group. I worked a lot with the criminal justice system too. We had kids that were on probation.
Okay.
Referred through the court system. And I also had a private practice that I started in somewhere in the 70s. I was after 75, because I was already up in Hamilton where the drug treatment program was.
Okay.
So it would have been maybe 76 or something like that. And since people knew that I would work with teenagers, at that time I was getting a lot of referrals from the school systems and whatnot, or what have you.
Okay. I bet they loved having you as a resource.
Yeah, not everybody likes teenagers.
That's right. That's right.
And I do, so.
What an exciting.
And it was. And a lot of times kids will act out because they don't know how to ask for help. So do adults, for that matter. It's another story. I did part of my internship way back when it was what was then called the Municipal Court Psychiatric Clinic. Which was another interesting thing about Cincinnati.
Yeah.
Psychiatry and psychology got together in the 50s sometime and started a program which later was the Municipal Court Psychiatric Clinic and later on the Forensic Center. But in the early days, the idea was that people who get arrested and convicted of things like, particularly like shoplifting or exposure, are probably not necessarily criminals, and are asking for help very indirectly and not terribly appropriately, but that's what they're doing. And so they set up a program where the court had a social worker. The social worker sat in court next to the judge, and most of the judges were very responsive to this. And if the social worker approached the judge and say, "Your Honor, I think this," the person would have been convicted. The clinic was not in the position of adjudicating guilt or innocence, which took a lot of pressure off those of us who were clinicians there. But then the sentencing would be deferred until the staff at the clinic had investigated and could make a report. And we could make recommendations like probation with a requirement for counseling and a referral to an appropriate agency.
How wonderful.
Or, some whatever. I mean, we got some people who clearly were criminals and were not going to be... And there were people I ran into who said, I don't want to mess around with this, just let me go to the workhouse. Okay. But there were a lot of people who got, were referred for counseling, and, the probation was mainly a way of keeping them in the system and, doing some follow-up at that point. It was a very interesting program, considering it must have been started in either the middle to late 50s, I would say. I don't know, and it was somebody from psychiatry. But they had a full complement of psychology, psychiatry, psychology, social work, all of that by the time I got there, which was in the early middle 60s, about 64, I think, someplace in there. The same in Hamilton. I mean, there's been some very ingenious programming done in Ohio that I think most people don't know about. There was a sergeant on the police force in Hamilton back in the day who knew everybody in town. And when he'd catch a teenage kid acting out, he would basically do you want me to tell your parents? And from that came the Youth Aid Bureau, which was one of the first programs in the country to do intervention through the criminal justice system to keep kids out of the system.
Wow. And
it was started by a sergeant whose name eludes me at the moment, in Hamilton.
What an exciting
Butler
time.
County, Ohio. Had to be in the 60s. He was just on the edge of retiring when I started work there in 75, but everybody knew him. He'd been around forever.
Wow.
And he had the Youth Aid Bureau up and running, and it had been expanded. I mean, it was one of those things that somebody looked at it and said, we've got to do something. We don't want these kids becoming, they're not really criminals, they're pranking around, their judgment is terrible, whatever. We can always adjudicate the ones that need it in the court system. What do we do? So the early diversion.
Very nice.
It was.
What an exciting time. And at that point, was there a difference in how they interacted with male and female clients in the drug treatment situations?
I would have to say, certainly not in the drug treatment program that I ran, but we were, much of our population was male because women could keep things hidden. And some of the girls we got were way, way, way far down the road because they weren't identified or weren't picked up. And the word in general in the field at that time, I would have to say, was when a girl gets in trouble, it's much worse. And I think it was because they had to scream louder to get any kind of help. Functionally is what that meant. And I remember I backed into the substance abuse field in around 1962. Family Service of the Greater Cincinnati area had extremely good success in getting alcoholic men sober and dry. And the expectation was that once that happened, everything would be okay. Then they found that everything was very much not okay. Marriages were falling apart. So they did this research project on the wives and families of alcoholic men. It was published as a monograph. And Mert Krause, who was a psychologist in charge of the research part of it, at the University of Cincinnati, he later moved to Chicago, who was somebody whom I admired greatly. He was an adjunct. He was not going to make, I remember he did a colloquium, and I approached him after that and asked if he was going to be teaching any courses. And he said no. And his field was experimental design. He was a brilliant man, or is. He may still be alive. And, I said something about wishing I could take some courses from him. And about 3 weeks later, he found me walking across campus and asked if I wanted to be involved as a research associate on this project. I had no conscious interest in alcoholism as such at that time, but I really wanted to work with Mert. And so I did that. And I can remember serious discussions between Vera Lindbeck, who was a social worker, and Pauline Cohen, also a social worker, who were on the staff of this project, who headed the project. In fact, Pauline did. and some of the other early alcoholism experts as to whether there was such a thing as female alcoholism.
Oh,
because it was so covert at that time and so shameful that there were actually serious discussions of, it might be a sex-linked trait like hemophilia. And then some people saying, no, it's just, the women are alcoholic, but that was why it was the wives and families of alcoholic men, because
very interesting.
there was not enough
Evidence.
awareness or evidence about women, and that would have been I started there with that in 62, 63, 62, I think. So yeah, there were real differences with regard to
yes.
who showed up in your population.
Yes.
And even later on when I was doing, I didn't develop it, I wrote about the rap as an alternative modality, and my husband and I were both among the founders of, and then people who ran the Cincinnati Free Clinic, starting informally in '69. Well, what happened was in the 60s, drug abuse came to the white teenage population, and before that it was of no concern to anybody, particularly as far as I know. And AA was, alcoholics were hopeless, and anyway, there's this thing called AA, which is not run by professionals, so it's obviously worthless, but some people think it might help. That was my whole graduate training on the subject of alcohol, and I won't tell you what the training I got about other kinds of substance abuse, or because it's shameful. But in any case, in the late, here in Cincinnati in the late 60s, obviously, started earlier, I was a little behind the time. There was a huge wave of, the psychedelics and all this, and that's how I got involved with the Ohio Hospital Association project. But my husband, who's a physician, and I were going, out in those neighborhoods and being approached. Literally, we were doing curbside consultation, talking people down from bad trips, on the curbside.
Wow.
And it became clear to us very quickly that it went way beyond what we could do around our kitchen table or out in the neighborhood. And I won't go into all the details, but the I'm blocking on his name. He later went on to write. He writes these medical thriller things, big thick books. He was doing his public health service in Cincinnati at that time, and a medical student at the time named Joan Levy, and he got together, and they had the time in the mimeograph machine, and they put out word saying that they were trying to organize something, so Bill and I got involved, and we wound up running the rap room. And I later decided to see if it was actually an autonomous modality, which I believe it is, and started a rap at the Drop-In Center for Alcoholic Men, which it was then called, in Cincinnati, and was down at the Drop-In Center 2 nights a week for a couple of years volunteering and getting data for my study. So, yeah. And the thing about that was that when you talk to Skid Row drugs, the only thing worse than the guy who's falling down unconscious at your feet was a woman. A woman alcoholic coming in there was just absolutely abused by the men.
Oh.
I don't mean physically, but I mean it was very derogatory. They were ashamed of themselves, but they found her even more shameful.
Wow.
And that led to the development of a center for women.
Okay.
That was developed by a caseworker named Almas. I kept blocking on her last name right now, it doesn't matter. But we needed a center for women, and she got involved in setting that up, and I think it's still running somewhere under some other auspices down over the Rhine. She died later. She died of cancer. So yeah, there were a lot of differences, and sometimes you didn't see the women because it was so shameful in a lot of those instances. And before women got into the job market, it was much easier to conceal problems, not just AOD, although that was one of the more obvious ones, but other things, because you weren't necessarily out in the community.
Very interesting.
There were those kinds of differences, as well as academic issues. In my first year graduate school cohort, there were probably at the beginning of the year there were maybe 25 or 30 of us. Obviously, a few people dropped out here and there over the first year for whatever sets of reasons. But there were maybe only 5 or 6 women.
And did those women stay through the
several people did.
Okay.
Okay, and of the 4 or 5 of us that I remember, and there may be some that at this point I don't, there were more peripheral or whatnot or what have you, but there were 4 or 5 of us, and the rankings, we knew the rankings in that class very clearly. And there were 3 or 4 of us that were always in contention for the top 3 spots. And the division between the top 3 spots was usually a matter of 1 or 2 points. It was obviously not statistically significant. There was one guy who was part of that group by and large. Occasionally somebody else, might make it into pop in. But yeah, the women were among the absolute top students. You sort of had to be.
Yeah, I guess so, to prove that you really could make it.
And that you were hopefully going to make it. But yeah.
That's incredible. And how did you make it? What helped you get through that time, do you think?
Well, at the time, I didn't think I had any options.
That probably is a very good mindset.
To this day, I am a lousy typist. I mean, I needed to be able to support myself.
You had to use your intellect. You couldn't.
I had known I wanted to be a psychologist since I was 10. My father was a sociologist, and my mother practiced as a child psychologist, among the other things that they did. But truly, I didn't have a clue as to what else I could do. And I had never particularly wanted to be a secretary or a teacher or a nurse. And I also knew that I needed to be able to support myself. So I really had limited options. I got to do this or I'm going to be out on the street and nowhere to go.
Oh, that's wonderful.
It was very practical. I wanted to do it too, but that's another story. I was interested. I was a gung-ho girl graduate student. But in terms of practical alternatives, if I couldn't and the other thing, I mean, I'll be really honest about it. When I came to Cincinnati, the person I was with and I had enough money for tuition for one semester. UC at that time was on the semester system. I think it's recently gone back. Shortly thereafter, it went to quarters, but we had enough money for the first semester. So I went down to the office, the Arts and Sciences undergraduate. I came in as an advanced undergraduate and said, what do I have to do to get a tuition scholarship? Well, I was told, it's a combination of grades and need. And I said, okay, what kind of a grade point average do I need to qualify? And, oh, well, we can't really tell you that. Depends on how many people apply and what their what their economic needs are. Well, I knew if I couldn't demonstrate economic need, there wasn't anybody on the planet who could. It was guaranteed. So I decided I'd better get a 4-point. Because I figured if I had a 4-point, which was the highest
nobody
could get, and if I couldn't demonstrate financial need, nobody could. Honestly, I mean, my person I was with and I were here on our own. And no support from anywhere else. There was a freeze on hiring at the state level, so jobs were almost impossible to get. It's certainly anything in our field. He was working part-time nights in a shoe factory at that time, and I was trying to find any kind of job. So and we were supporting ourselves, so there was, so I went out and got the 4-point. And once again, I did not perceive I had much of an alternative.
Right. Well, that's... You mentioned before the interview kind of the power of positive thinking that your mother taught you.
Desperational also do a lot. So there I was.
Oh, that's really fascinating.
And after that, I guess it sort of became kind of a habit to do the best I could. Well, I do that anyway. But, yeah.
Wow.
And we were very fortunate actually, because it was much easier there was much more support for academic scholarships tuition scholarships were available. We still had to buy books and survive economically, but you could get a tuition scholarship if you got the grades and you could demonstrate the financial need. And then when in graduate school later on, there were graduate TAs and research assistants, things like that, that were not that difficult to come by. I think some things have changed very significantly in that area from what I've heard and what I've read. But yeah, and, the idea, when I was in high school, I graduated in '57. I was a very, very bright woman. I grew up in a rural area, I should say. I grew up on a farm, and her folks' farm, and she was engaged in high school to a guy she'd known who was going to farm. I think they lived on adjacent farms, and they were going to, the parents, it's all fine. The teachers tried like anything to get her to go to college, which they didn't normally do with women.
Interesting.
In the in the 50s, in Dutchess County, rural New York State.
So you had some very advanced thinking.
Teachers. We did, absolutely. And she just said, no, her boyfriend was graduating from college. He was a little older than she was when she graduated high school, and they were going to get married. And it wasn't because she lacked anything in smarts, and I'm sure she may have gone back later. I don't know. We weren't really close friends, but I admired her. She's very good. But back in those days, you didn't need college to make your way in the world. And it was interesting because they did not put pressure. Most of the girls in my high school graduating class, if they were going on for any additional education, were going to business school or possibly nursing or maybe the teacher's college. But there weren't very many other careers mentioned in the lists that come out. What are you going to do when you graduate, sort of a thing. And we were considered pretty. It was a rural central school, so we had vocational programs in agriculture. Future Farmers of America was the single largest extracurricular activity, followed very closely by the drama club. We had an excellent school. They were sending college teachers around to teach high school students back in those days. And this was before Sputnik even. And so it was really very advanced.
Yes.
And, we had 10% of our graduating class going to college, among them some women, but it was not considered a requirement or a necessity, and you were considered, not a little odd, but, what are you doing that for? Sort of a thing.
Wasting
you
your
were
time.
Totally discouraged, but it was a hugely different kind of world. And some of that was true for guys, too. You didn't go to college unless you had some specific career in mind that required that. Engineering or physics, or you wanted to teach.
Very interesting. Well, I think we're very fortunate that you did go to college and you persevered through a graduate school that was not too friendly at certain points.
I feel in many ways very blessed. And when I don't ordinarily sit around musing over the past, but when I do, I realize how much change has taken place.
Absolutely.
And how essential that change has been, and I hope continues to be. I mean, last night, I don't know if the fact that the people who showed up for the swearing in were all women, although there was one man listed on the program, apparently wasn't able to make it. But somebody mentioned that 70% of the new licensees are women.
Yes.
Which,
quite an interesting shift.
It was a very interesting shift. When I think that maybe 20%, I'm not sure, it would somewhere between 20-25% of our cohort in 61 was women, probably. Certainly of the ones that stuck with it after the first semester or two.
Yes.
And women were not seen as the focus of the field by any stretch. It's been a huge change, and I think a good one.
Well, I really appreciate your taking the time to share
I was happy to be asked,
memories.
honored to be asked. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. And I think it will provide a lot of inspiration for young women who are facing adversity of a different kind in
Yeah.
this era, and to get an appreciation for how far we've come in this period of time.
Yeah.
I would say relatively short period of time.
Yeah, I didn't think of it as being as long as it is, but I just realized this is probably my 30th OPA.
Wow. Wow.
It might even be more than that because for a while I was going to both.
Sure.
So I don't know exactly, but I started coming in 1980, and the other night I went, oh my word,
So do you
30 years.
Is OWP 30 years old now?
Give or take, yeah.
Okay.
Well, my recollection, and you can clarify this with some of the other women who were around, is that that meeting in 1980 was when Joanne King raised the possibility, and we started organizing it then. I think in the beginning it was not called OWP.
Okay.
I noted in our program, in our newsletter, that Seth Zimmerman was president from 83 to 86, which suggests that it took us a couple of years to get that organized.
Yes, and that coincides with, I was at Wright State from 82.
Okay.
No, 84 to 88, and I remember Steph Zimmerman, and that's interesting.
And she was one of the other women who raised their hands at that meeting, and she and I think it was Jane.
Okay.
And also Sally Wilson from Cleveland, who got the original bylaws and constitution and whatnot together.
Wow.
And then Kathy Malloy was involved.
Okay.
And I got Kathy Mizak involved in all of that because I was doing the regional thing. We were having a brunch once or twice a year, and I would, invited women psychologists that I knew to come. Somebody came down from Oxford. I don't remember who it was now. And Kathy Mizak got involved. She had just started coming to OPA meetings too, I believe. That was a little bit later on. But it took us a while to, have some meetings in order to begin to organize, begin to consider how we might want to focus our activities, and then to draw up some bylaws and make ourselves into a group and decide we needed officers and whatnot and what have you. So that would have been about right. And I'm not sure if we didn't have something before that, but we may not have named it yet. So maybe Jane will have that.
Yes. Oh,
information.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I
Thank you
appreciate
for
your
asking
time.
me.
You're welcome. You're welcome. You can hop up anytime you want to. Let's see. How do I stop?